The morning of December 18th, 1944, near Noville, Belgium, brought fog so thick that Sergeant Paul Helm couldn't see beyond the frost-rimmed windshield of his half-track. The cold bit through 3 layers of wool, through the leather of his gloves, settling into bones that hadn't been warm since Normandy. Behind him, 150 men from the 20th Armoured Infantry Battalion huddled in whatever shelter the frozen Ardennes forest offered, their breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the grey dawn. They were supposed to be resting, rotating back from the front lines that had grown quiet through December. Instead, they'd been pulled north at midnight, told only that something big was happening, that German armour had broken through somewhere in the fog. Helm had carried a bazooka since Utah Beach. The M1A1 rocket launcher, 44 pounds of steel tube and simple optics, designed by a man named Leslie Skinner in 1942, when America had nothing that could stop a German tank. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The weapon seemed almost primitive compared to the machines it was meant to destroy. 2.36 inches of diameter, firing a 3.5-pound rocket that could theoretically penetrate 4 inches of armour at 300 yards. Theoretically. Helm had seen bazookas bounce off Panzer frontal armour in Normandy, watched the shaped charge fail to detonate, watched men die because the mathematics of penetration didn't account for angle or weather, or the simple fact that German steel was very, very good. Now, in the fog near Noville, he heard them before he saw them. The distinctive grinding roar of German tank engines, multiple engines, the sound carrying strangely through the dense air. Then the fog began to glow, diffused by headlights that shouldn't have been on, and Helm understood with cold certainty that whoever was commanding those Panzers believed they faced no opposition. The first tank emerged from the white curtain like something from a nightmare, massive and angular, its long gun elevated slightly as if searching. A Panzer IV. Helm recognized the profile instantly. Behind it came another, then another, their shapes solidifying as they advanced down the narrow forest road. He counted 6 before the fog swallowed the column again, but the engine noise suggested many more. The German breakthrough that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge had begun 3 days earlier, on December 16th. 3 German armies, 28 divisions, over 400,000 men, supported by nearly 1,500 armoured vehicles, had smashed into the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes. The offensive was Hitler's last gamble in the West, a desperate attempt to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the combined weight of American industrial production and Soviet manpower crushed Germany between them. For 3 days, American units had been overrun, surrounded, or forced into chaotic retreat as German spearheads drove west toward the Meuse River. Helm's unit hadn't been at full strength since November. The 20th Armoured Infantry Battalion had lost men to trench foot, to artillery, to the grinding attrition of the drive across France. They'd been pulled back to what was supposed to be a quiet sector, a place to integrate replacements and repair equipment. Instead, they'd been caught in the path of the 5th Panzer Army's northern thrust, and now they were all that stood between these German tanks and the road junction at Noville, a crossroads that would become crucial in the developing battle. The commander of Kampfgruppe Hansen, Obersturmbannführer Max Hansen of the 1st SS Panzer Division, had every reason for confidence that morning. His battle group consisted of 23 tanks, mostly Panzer IVs with a handful of the newer Panthers, supported by mechanized infantry and self-propelled guns. They'd broken through the American lines the previous day, encountered only scattered resistance, and now rolled toward what reconnaissance reported as a lightly defended crossroads. Hansen's orders were explicit. Seize Noville, push west to the Meuse, maintain momentum. Speed was everything. The entire offensive depended on capturing Allied fuel dumps before German tanks ran dry, on reaching the Meuse bridges before American reinforcements could establish defensive lines. Hansen understood armor warfare in a way few American officers did in late 1944. He'd fought in Russia, seen what massed tank formations could accomplish when properly employed, learned the brutal lessons of the Eastern Front, where German tactical superiority had been slowly ground down by Soviet numerical advantage and American supplied materiel. The Panzer IV under his command was a veteran's tank, proven in 3 years of combat across 2 continents. Its 75mm gun could engage targets at ranges where American Shermans became death traps. Its frontal armor, 80mm thick on the hull and 50mm on the turret, could defeat most American anti-tank weapons when properly angled. The tank weighed 25 tons, carried an 85-round ammunition load, and could travel at 15 miles per hour cross-country. It was, by late 1944, not Germany's most advanced tank, but it was reliable, available, and deadly in the hands of experienced crews. More importantly, Hansen's crews were experienced. They'd survived Normandy, survived the long retreat across France, survived because they understood the machine they operated and respected the enemy they faced. They knew American tank destroyers were dangerous at range, knew to avoid the killing zones where American artillery could mass fire, knew that American infantry rarely had effective anti-tank weapons beyond the occasional bazooka team that could be suppressed with machine gun fire. The prevailing wisdom, developed through hard combat, was that American infantry posed minimal threat to armor operating at speed. The bazooka's effective range was listed as 300 yards, but battlefield experience suggested it was far less, perhaps 100 yards or even closer for reliable penetration. This belief wasn't arrogance, it was based on verified experience. Throughout the Normandy campaign and the subsequent fighting across France, German armor had consistently dominated American infantry when employed correctly. The American M4 Sherman tank, armed with a 75mm gun, could barely penetrate Panzer IV frontal armor at combat ranges. The American towed anti-tank guns were effective but vulnerable to suppression. And the bazooka, while psychologically intimidating with its distinctive firing signature and backblast, had proven inconsistent. German tankers had seen bazookas fail to penetrate, fail to detonate, strike at angles that caused the shaped charge to slip off the armor without effect. They'd learned to button up their hatches, maintain speed, and suppress suspected bazooka positions with machine gun fire. The weapon was dangerous only if you let infantry close to point-blank range, and German doctrine emphasized exactly that. Never let enemy infantry get close. Hansen's confidence as his battle group advanced through the fog wasn't hubris. It was professional assessment based on 3 years of combat data. His tanks outnumbered any American force likely to be at Noville. His crews were veterans. His machines, while worn from months of fighting, were mechanically sound and properly supplied with ammunition. The fog that reduced visibility to less than 50 yards was an inconvenience, nothing more. American infantry without tank support couldn't stop a determined armored thrust. This was established fact, proven repeatedly on battlefields from Kasserine Pass to the hedgerows of Normandy. What Hansen couldn't know from the fog-shrouded road approaching Noville, was that the 150 American soldiers waiting in the frozen forest weren't a random collection of rear echelon troops caught by the German offensive. They were men from the 20th Armoured Infantry Battalion, trained specifically to fight alongside tanks, equipped and indoctrinated to engage armoured vehicles as their primary mission. More critically, they'd been issued the improved M9A1 bazooka just weeks earlier, a weapon that looked identical to its predecessor, but incorporated crucial modifications based on 20 months of combat feedback. Sergeant Helm's Bazooka, manufactured in September 1944 at the General Electric plant in Bridgeport, Connecticut, reflected hard lessons learned from North Africa through Normandy. The original Mon Bazooka, rushed into production in 1942, had suffered from a catastrophic flaw. Its electrical firing system frequently failed in cold or wet conditions. The weapon used a battery-powered magneto to generate the spark that ignited the rocket motor, and moisture or cold temperatures would prevent ignition, leaving soldiers with a useless tube while German tanks closed the distance. The improved M9A1 replaced the electrical system with a simpler mechanical trigger that worked in any conditions. The modification seemed minor, but it transformed the weapon's reliability from approximately 60% to over 95%. The rocket itself had also evolved. The M6A3 rocket that Helm loaded that morning weighed 3 pounds, 11 ounces, slightly heavier than earlier versions because it carried more explosive. The shaped charge warhead contained 8 ounces of pentalite, an explosive mixture of PETN and TNT that, when properly detonated, could generate a jet of superheated metal travelling at over 25,000 feet per second. This jet could penetrate up to 5 inches of homogeneous armour plate when striking at 90 degrees, less at angles, but still far more than the 4 inches claimed in the weapon's official specifications. More importantly, American ordnance engineers had refined the standoff distance, the gap between the warhead's copper cone and the armour plate that was crucial for shaped charge effectiveness. The improved rocket detonated at exactly the right distance to maximize penetration. But specifications meant nothing without training, and the men of the 20th Armoured Infantry had trained extensively with their bazookas. They understood that the weapon's effective range wasn't determined by how far the rocket could travel. It could fly 800 yards before the motor burned out, but by how close you needed to be to guarantee penetration and, more critically, to guarantee hitting a moving target. The official manual specified 300 yards. Veterans like Helm knew the real number was half that, preferably closer. They'd practiced on disabled German tanks captured in France, learned that the Panzer IV's side armour was only 30 millimeters thick, that the engine deck was vulnerable, that a shot into the rear hull where ammunition was stored could catastrophically kill a tank. They'd learned to work in pairs, one man loading while the other aimed, to position themselves where German machine guns couldn't suppress them, to wait for the perfect moment rather than wasting rockets on low-probability shots. The American doctrine for bazooka employment in late 1944 emphasized ambush tactics. Unlike German Panzerfausts, which were single-shot disposable weapons effective only at suicidal ranges, the bazooka was a crew-served weapon meant for calculated engagement. The recommended technique was to allow enemy armour to close to within 100 yards, often closer, then engage from concealed positions at angles that maximized penetration. This required extraordinary discipline. The psychological ability to watch tons of steel and high-explosive approach while remaining hidden, trusting that your position was truly concealed and that your weapon would function when needed. It required the kind of nerve that comes only from training or from having no other choice. Helm and his men, crouched in the frozen forest as the sound of German tank engines grew louder, had both training and no other choice. They'd positioned their bazookas during the brief darkness before dawn, selecting spots where the narrow forest road would canalize German armour, where the fog would hide their positions until the last possible moment. They had 42 rockets between them, 14 teams of gunner and loader, and orders that were brutally simple: stop the German breakthrough or die trying. The first German tank died at 7:23 in the morning, though Sergeant Helm wouldn't know the exact time until later, when he could finally check his watch with hands that had stopped shaking. The Panzer IV emerged from the fog approximately 70 yards from his position, close enough that Helm could see the registration numbers painted on its turret, close enough to hear the squeak of its bogie wheels over the engine roar. The tank commander's hatch was open, a violation of proper combat procedure, but understandable given the fog and the presumed absence of enemy forces. A young face looked out, scanning the forest, seeing nothing but trees and mist. Helm's loader, Private First Class Robert Chen from Sacramento, California, had already tapped his shoulder twice, the signal that the rocket was loaded and the weapon was ready. Chen had joined the battalion in October as a replacement, had fired exactly 11 practice rounds during training, and now crouched behind Helm with his hands on the tube, steadying it against the recoil that would come. The bazooka's optical sight was useless in the fog, so Helm aimed by instinct and experience, placing the iron sights on the junction where the Panzer's turret met its hull, a spot he knew from captured vehicle examination was particularly vulnerable. The side armour there was only 30 millimeters, barely thicker than a silver dollar, and behind it lay the hand-traversed ammunition racks where the tank stored its 75mm rounds. He squeezed the trigger. The mechanical firing pin struck the rocket's igniter with a sharp click, and then the world became noise and light. The rocket motor ignited with a roar that seemed impossibly loud in the fog-deadened air, the backblast throwing up a cloud of frozen earth and pine needles. The rocket itself, a blur of motion trailing smoke, crossed the 70 yards in less than a second, struck the Panzer's side armour at approximately 85 degrees, and detonated. The shaped charge explosion was distinctive, a sharp crack rather than the boom of high explosive, followed immediately by a secondary explosion from inside the tank as the jet of superheated metal ignited stored ammunition. The Panzer IV stopped as if it had struck a wall. Black smoke began pouring from every hatch and vision slit. The commander, the young face Helm had seen seconds before, emerged from the turret hatch wreathed in flames, rolled off the tank's deck, and lay still in the road. No one else came out. 300 yards behind the destroyed tank, Obersturmbannführer Hansen heard the explosion but couldn't see its cause through the fog. His radio crackled with confused reports from the lead platoon. Tank destroyed. Infantry weapons. Unknown number of enemy. Hansen ordered his column to deploy from march formation into combat line, tanks spreading out into the forest on either side of the road, infantry dismounting to sweep for American positions. It was the correct tactical response, textbook armour, doctrine, for encountering unexpected resistance. It was also exactly what Helm and the other American bazooka teams had anticipated. The forest terrain near Noville was mixed pine and hardwood, with heavy undergrowth that limited vehicle movement to the road and a few cleared areas. When Hansen's panzers spread into combat formation, they were forced to advance slowly, navigating between trees, maintaining visual contact with adjacent tanks despite the fog that reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. This slow, channelized movement was precisely what made them vulnerable. The bazooka's greatest weakness, its limited range and the time required to reload, became irrelevant when targets approached at walking speed through terrain that prevented rapid maneuver. The second tank died at 7:28, 5 minutes after the first. Private James Morrison from Tennessee, a bazooka gunner who'd fought since Normandy, waited until a Panzer IV passed within 40 yards of his position before firing into its engine deck. The rocket penetrated the thin armour covering the Maybach engine, detonating among fuel lines and oil reservoirs. The tank didn't explode dramatically. It simply stopped, smoke pouring from its engine compartment, crew abandoning the vehicle before flames could spread to the fighting compartment. Morrison and his loader were already moving to a secondary position before the German machine gunners could locate their firing signature. By 7:45, 6 German tanks had been destroyed or disabled, and Hansen's advance had stalled completely. His battle group, designed for rapid exploitation, was trapped in a meeting engagement against an enemy force that remained invisible in the fog and forest. Every time his tanks attempted to advance, rockets streaked from new positions. Every time his infantry attempted to suppress suspected bazooka teams, the Americans had already displaced. The mathematics of the engagement were brutally simple. Each German tank represented months of industrial production, hundreds of man-hours, scarce resources diverted from a war economy that was already collapsing. Each American bazooka rocket cost approximately $18 to manufacture and could be replaced overnight from factories that produced thousands per day. What Hansen experienced in the fog near Noville wasn't simply tactical surprise. It was the dissolution of everything he understood about armored warfare against American forces. The battle group that had advanced confidently through the dawn was now stationary, burning vehicles marking their attempted advance like funeral pyres. German tank crews, veterans who'd survived the Eastern Front, sat buttoned up inside their Panzers, unable to advance, unable to retreat, unable to identify targets through the combination of fog and forest that reduced their vaunted long-range guns to irrelevance. The Panzer IV's 75mm KWK-40 gun could penetrate 4 inches of armour at 2,000 yards under ideal conditions. It could engage targets accurately at ranges where American Shermans became helpless. But in the forest near Noville, there were no 2,000-yard sight lines. There were no clear fields of fire. There was only fog and trees, and the sudden streak of a bazooka rocket emerging from concealment at ranges so close that the German crews had no time to traverse their turrets, no time to acquire targets, no time to do anything but die or abandon their vehicles. By 8:15, 9 German tanks had been knocked out. Hansen had committed his reserve platoon, 4 Panthers that represented the most advanced armour in his battle group. The Panther was superior to the Panzer IV in almost every measurable way. Heavier armour, more powerful gun, better mobility. Its frontal armour, 80mm thick and sloped at 55 degrees, was effectively immune to the American 75mm Sherman gun at combat ranges. But in the forest, in the fog, at ranges measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards, the Panther's advantages became meaningless. Its side armour was only 40mm thick, its engine deck was vulnerable, and the bazooka's shaped charge, which relied on explosive force rather than kinetic energy, didn't care about slope or angles of attack. It cared only about whether the copper jet could form properly, and whether there was enough standoff distance for penetration. The first Panther died at 8:22, killed by Sergeant Helm's second shot of the morning. The massive tank, worth more than a dozen Panzer IVs in terms of manufacturing resources, had attempted to flank the American positions by pushing through a cleared area north of the road. Helm had repositioned after his first kill, moving 300 yards to a spot where he'd guessed German armour might attempt to manoeuvre. When the Panther appeared, moving slowly through the undergrowth, Helm waited until it crased, was nearly perpendicular to his position, exposing its thinner side armour, then fired at a range of approximately 60 yards. The rocket struck just below the turret ring, penetrating the 40mm side armour and detonating inside the fighting compartment. The Panther stopped immediately, smoke pouring from its hatches. 3 crew members escaped, 2 didn't. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What made the engagement near Noville particularly devastating for Hansen's battle group wasn't just the loss of tanks, it was the loss of momentum. The loss of the one asset that German forces in the Battle of the Bulge couldn't afford to lose: time. Every hour spent fighting for a crossroads was an hour American reinforcements could move into blocking positions. Every tank destroyed was a tank that couldn't push west toward the Meuse. Every casualty was a veteran crew member who couldn't be replaced. The offensive that Hitler had planned as a lightning thrust to split the Allied armies was becoming a grinding attrition battle that Germany couldn't win. By 9 o'clock, 11 German tanks had been destroyed, and 4 more were damaged badly enough that their crews had abandoned them. Hansen's radio crackled with increasingly desperate reports from his tank commanders. Surrounded by infantry. Cannot identify enemy positions. Request artillery support. But artillery support was unavailable. The German guns were still fighting their way forward through roads clogged with supply vehicles, and even if they'd been in range, the fog made fire direction impossible. Hansen was trapped in a commander's nightmare, strong enough to hold his position but too weak to advance, unable to retreat without abandoning disabled vehicles and admitting failure, unable to break through an enemy force that he still couldn't properly identify or locate. The American infantry, meanwhile, were experiencing their own revelation. Every man who'd fired a bazooka that morning had expected mechanical failure, had expected the weapon to misfire or the rocket to fail to detonate. They'd been trained on a weapon that was notoriously unreliable, had heard stories from Normandy about bazookas that wouldn't fire in rain or cold. But the improved M9A1 worked. It worked in temperatures barely above zero. It worked when fired by men whose hands were numb from cold. It worked consistently, repeatedly, decisively. The shaped charge warheads penetrated German armor that was supposed to be invulnerable to infantry weapons. They killed Panthers that were supposed to be unstoppable by anything except dedicated tank destroyers or heavy artillery. Sergeant Helm, repositioning for a third shot, found himself thinking about mathematics. Each rocket weighed less than 4 pounds. Each cost less than a day's wages for a factory worker. Each could destroy a machine that represented months of scarce resources, that required trained crews, that embodied years of German engineering expertise. The exchange rate wasn't just favourable, it was catastrophic for the Germans. At 9:45, 3 hours after the first German tank had emerged from the fog, Obersturmbannführer Hansen made the decision that would define the engagement. He ordered his battle group to withdraw. The order came not from defeat in any conventional sense. His remaining tanks were still operational, his infantry still combat effective, but from the recognition that continuing the attack would simply produce more casualties without achieving the objective. Noville remained in American hands. The road junction remained blocked, and 14 German tanks, including 2 Panthers, sat burning or disabled in the forest approaches to the town. The withdrawal itself became a nightmare. German armour doctrine emphasised aggressive manoeuvre, rapid exploitation, maintaining contact with enemy forces to prevent their escape or reorganisation. It did not emphasise retreat under fire from an enemy you couldn't locate. Hansen's remaining tanks had to back down the narrow forest road under sporadic bazooka fire, unable to turn around, unable to suppress enemy positions they couldn't see. 2 more tanks were damaged during the withdrawal when rockets struck their more vulnerable rear armour. Crews abandoned vehicles that were only lightly damaged because they feared being trapped inside if another rocket hit. Infantry who'd dismounted to support the attack had to be recalled under fire, suffering casualties from American riflemen who'd remained quiet during the armour engagement, but now opened up with Moen Garons and Browning automatic rifles. By 10:30, Hansen's battle group had withdrawn to positions approximately 2 miles from Noville, regrouping in an area where the fog was beginning to lift. He conducted a rapid assessment of his force and discovered that of the 23 tanks he'd commanded that morning, only 14 were still operational. 9 had been destroyed outright, their crews dead or wounded. 5 more had been damaged badly enough to require maintenance that couldn't be performed under field conditions. His infantry had taken casualties estimated at 40 men killed or wounded, and he'd accomplished nothing. The American force at Noville, which reconnaissance had reported as negligible, had stopped a reinforced Panzer battle group using nothing but infantry weapons. The survivors of Hansen's tank crews gathered in small groups, smoking, speaking in low voices, trying to process what had happened. These were men who'd fought across Russia, who'd survived Normandy, who understood armoured warfare as well as any soldiers in the world. They'd been trained that infantry without tank or artillery support couldn't stop determined armour. They'd been taught that the American bazooka was dangerous only at suicidal ranges, that proper tactics and crew discipline could defeat infantry anti-tank weapons. Everything they'd believed about the hierarchy of weapons systems, the supremacy of armour over infantry, the technological advantage that German engineering provided, had been challenged in 3 hours of fog-shrouded combat. Lieutenant Klaus Werner, commander of the 1st Panzer IV, destroyed that morning. The one Sergeant Helm had killed at 7:23, had survived by pure chance. He'd been standing in the turret hatch when the bazooka rocket struck, had been thrown clear by the force of the explosion, had watched his tank burn, with his crew still inside, because the internal detonation of stored ammunition had jammed the escape hatches. Werner sat now with his head in his hands, wearing a jacket borrowed from another crew because his own uniform had been burned, trying to understand how American infantry had achieved what Soviet anti-tank guns often failed to accomplish: the complete destruction of his problem vehicle in a single shot. The technical after-action reports that Hansen would file in the following days attempted to rationalize the defeat. The fog had negated German advantages in range and optics. The terrain had channelized movement and prevented proper deployment. The American force had been larger and better positioned than reconnaissance had indicated. All of these explanations were true. All of them missed the fundamental point. American industrial capacity had produced a man-portable anti-tank weapon that was reliable, effective, and available in quantities that made German armour vulnerable in ways that doctrine hadn't anticipated. The bazooka in late 1944 wasn't the unreliable weapon that German tankers had learned to dismiss in Normandy. It was something new, something that changed the calculus of armoured warfare. For the American soldiers at Noville, the 3-hour engagement represented something equally profound. They'd stopped a German Panzer thrust, using weapons they'd been trained to distrust. They'd killed Panthers, the most advanced German tanks, with rockets that cost less than a hot meal at a New York restaurant. They'd proven that infantry, properly equipped and positioned, could defeat armour without requiring tanks or tank destroyers or artillery support. The psychological effect of this discovery would ripple through American forces in the Ardennes, transforming how infantry units approached the threat of German armour. The battle near Noville on December 18, 1944, produced statistics that would be analysed by military historians for decades. 23 German tanks committed to the attack, 14 destroyed or damaged beyond field repair, 9 more withdrawn with minor damage or mechanical issues. Against this, the American force suffered 12 killed and 27 wounded, almost all from German machine gun and artillery fire during the withdrawal phase of the engagement. The exchange rate, measured purely in material terms, was catastrophic for the Germans. Approximately $2 million worth of armoured vehicles destroyed for the cost of perhaps 42 bazooka rockets, total value approximately $750. But the true cost couldn't be measured in currency or even in casualty statistics. Obersturmbannführer Hansen's battle group never recovered its combat effectiveness. The unit that had been designated as a spearhead formation intended to exploit breakthroughs and maintain momentum toward the Meuse River, spent the next 2 days consolidating, replacing crews, attempting to recover damaged vehicles. By the time it was ready to resume offensive operations, American reinforcements, including elements of the 101st Airborne Division, had established defensive positions throughout the northern shoulder of the Bulge. The moment for rapid exploitation, the brief window when German armour might have reached the Meuse before American forces could react, had closed. Hansen's battle group would spend the rest of the Battle of the Bulge fighting defensive actions, retreating slowly eastward, losing more tanks to American bazookas, tank destroyers, and artillery. The psychological cost was equally significant. German tank crews throughout the 5th Panzer Army heard about Noville within hours, through the informal communication networks that exist in all military organizations. The story grew in the telling, as such stories do, but the core facts remained undeniable. A reinforced Panzer battle group had been stopped by American infantry using man-portable weapons. Veterans who'd survived the Eastern Front, who'd learned to respect Soviet anti-tank guns and 34 tanks, now had to recalibrate their threat assessments to include American bazookas as primary dangers. The weapon that had been dismissed as marginally effective in Normandy had become something that required the same caution as encountering enemy armour. This shift in perception affected German tactical decision-making throughout the remainder of the Battle of the Bulge and into the final months of the war. Tank commanders became more cautious, more reluctant to advance into terrain where infantry might be concealed, more likely to request infantry support before pushing through forests or urban areas. This caution, entirely rational given the demonstrated effectiveness of American bazookas, slowed German operations and increased fuel consumption as tanks spent more time maneuvering and less time advancing. In a campaign where fuel shortages ultimately doomed German objectives, these delays mattered enormously. For Sergeant Paul Helm, the man who'd fired the first shot at Noville, the engagement became the defining experience of his war. He would survive the Battle of the Bulge, survive the push into Germany in early 1945, and return to the United States in July of that year. In interviews conducted decades later for the United States Army's Oral History Project, Helm spoke about Noville with remarkable clarity. He remembered the weight of the bazooka, the cold that made his fingers clumsy on the trigger, the moment of doubt before firing when he wondered if the weapon would even work. He remembered the shock of seeing the Panzer IV explode, the realization that the rocket had penetrated, that the weapon everyone had learned to distrust actually functioned as designed. What Helm understood, even at the time, was that Noville represented a turning point not just in the battle but in the nature of warfare itself. The shaped charge technology that powered the bazooka's warhead was relatively new, developed in the late 1930s, and rushed into production during the war. It represented a fundamental shift in how anti-tank weapons functioned. Where previous designs relied on kinetic energy, on heavy shells fired at high velocity to punch through armour, shaped charges used explosive force to create a jet of superheated metal that could defeat armour regardless of the projectile's velocity. This meant that a rocket fired from a tube resting on a soldier's shoulder could penetrate armour that previously required a dedicated anti-tank gun weighing thousands of pounds. The implications extended far beyond World War II. The bazooka's effectiveness at Noville and hundreds of similar engagements demonstrated that infantry could defeat armour without requiring massive supporting weapons. This realization would influence anti-tank weapon development for the next 8 decades, leading directly to modern systems like the RPG, the AT-4, and the Javelin missile. Every man-portable anti-tank weapon used in conflicts from Korea to Ukraine traces its conceptual lineage back to the M9A, one bazooka that proved itself in the forests of Belgium in December 1944. The engagement at Noville illuminated a truth that German military planners had understood intellectually, but hadn't fully grasped in its implications. American industrial capacity had fundamentally altered the mathematics of warfare. The bazooka rocket that Sergeant Helm fired on the morning of December 18th was manufactured at a General Electric facility in Bridgeport, Connecticut, one of 4 plants producing bazookas and rockets for the United States military in late 1944. These facilities operated 3 shifts per day, 7 days per week, producing approximately 15,000 rockets per day at peak production. The entire American bazooka rocket production for 1944 exceeded 4 million units. By comparison, German production of the Panzer Faust, their equivalent disposable anti-tank weapon, totaled approximately 6 million units for the entire war, 1943 through 1945. This seems comparable until you consider that the Panzer Faust was single-use, discarded after firing, while the bazooka launcher could be used indefinitely with proper maintenance. A single bazooka team at Noville could fire dozens of rockets if supplied, while a German infantryman with a Panzer Faust could fire once, then required a new weapon. The logistical implications were staggering. American forces could sustain anti-tank operations indefinitely. German forces were consuming irreplaceable stockpiles with each engagement. The Panzer IV that died first at Noville represented approximately 8,000 man-hours of production time, not counting the engine, transmission, weapons, and optics that were manufactured separately. Germany produced roughly 8,000 Panzer IVs during 1944, a significant number that represented the majority of German tank production that year. But Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under Allied bombing, fuel shortages, and loss of territory. Each tank destroyed was difficult to replace. Each crew killed represented training and experience that couldn't be replicated quickly. By December 1944, Germany was losing tanks faster than they could be produced, losing crews faster than they could be trained, fighting a war of attrition that simple mathematics indicated they couldn't win. The Americans, by contrast, were barely beginning to mobilize their full industrial potential. The United States produced approximately 17,000 M4 Sherman tanks during 1944 alone, more than double German production of all tank types combined. More importantly, American factories could sustain this production indefinitely. They had access to raw materials, skilled labor, and energy resources that German industry lacked. When an American tank was destroyed, it could be replaced in weeks. When an American soldier fell, he could be replaced by one of millions of men still undergoing training. The strategic implications were brutally clear. Time favored the Allies. Every day the war continued, weakened Germany, and strengthened its opponents. What happened at Noville was a microcosm of this larger industrial reality. German armor, technically sophisticated and operated by experienced crews, was being defeated by mass-produced American weapons that cost a fraction as much to manufacture. The engagement didn't turn on superior American tactics or better training or heroic individual actions, though all of these played roles. It turned on the fact that American industry could produce effective anti-tank weapons in quantities that made every German tank vulnerable, that could equip infantry with tools that transformed the balance of power between armor and foot soldiers. Obersturmbannführer Hansen, filing his after-action reports in the days following the battle, focused on tactical failures, inadequate reconnaissance, poor visibility, unfavorable terrain. His superiors, reading those reports at 5th Panzer Army headquarters, drew different conclusions. The Americans weren't just numerous and well-supplied. They were equipped with weapons that were individually effective and available in quantities that made German armor increasingly vulnerable. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with better tactics or more experienced crews. This was a strategic problem, a consequence of industrial disparity that no amount of battlefield skill could overcome. The soldiers of the 20th Armoured Infantry Battalion, resting in their positions after the German withdrawal, understood this at a visceral level that commanders in rear headquarters couldn't fully appreciate. They'd expended 42 rockets and stopped a reinforced Panzer battle group. They'd been resupplied with fresh ammunition within hours, trucks bringing forward crates of rockets from supply dumps that seemed inexhaustible. They didn't need to understand industrial production statistics to grasp the fundamental truth. They had more weapons than they could possibly use, while the Germans they faced were running out of everything. Private First Class Robert Chen, who'd loaded Sergeant Helm's bazooka during those first critical shots, would later recall the moment when a supply sergeant delivered 3 crates of bazooka rockets to their position, each crate containing 6 rockets packed in cosmoline. The sergeant had joked about having plenty more where that came from, and Chen had believed him. That confidence, the certainty that supplies would be available when needed, was itself a weapon that German forces couldn't match. American soldiers fought knowing they were backed by an industrial machine that could replace their losses. German soldiers fought knowing each bullet, each shell, each rocket brought them closer to having nothing left. Noville itself became a footnote in the larger Battle of the Bulge, a small engagement in a campaign that involved over 1 million soldiers and produced over 100,000 casualties. The crossroads that Sergeant Helm and his men defended on December 18th was captured by German forces 2 days later, then recaptured by American units in early January 1945 as the German offensive collapsed. The burned-out hulks of German tanks remained in the forest for weeks, slowly being covered by snow, eventually dragged away by salvage crews who melted them down to recover the steel for reconstruction after the war. But the lessons of Noville spread through American infantry units with remarkable speed. By late December, every rifle company in the European theatre understood that bazookas, properly employed, could stop German armour. Training protocols were updated to emphasize ambush tactics, close-range engagement, and the importance of firing at side or rear armour. Requisitions for bazooka rockets increased dramatically as infantry commanders requested more ammunition than official supply tables allocated. The weapon that had been considered supplemental equipment, issued primarily to specialized anti-tank sections, became standard for every infantry platoon. Sergeant Paul Helm never fired a bazooka in combat again after Noville. His unit was pulled from the line in late December, reorganized and re-equipped, and didn't return to combat until the final push across Germany in March 1945. By then, German armour was increasingly rare, fuel shortages and mechanical breakdowns having reduced panzer units to shadows of their former strength. Helm carried his bazooka across Germany to the Elbe River but never needed to fire it. The weapon that had saved his life and the lives of his men at Noville became a talisman, something he cleaned and maintained religiously but never used. After the war, Helm returned to Wisconsin, worked for 32 years at a paper mill, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke about his combat experience, except to other veterans who understood without explanation. In 1987, he was contacted by a German historian researching the Battle of the Bulge who discovered his name in American after-action reports. The historian asked if Helm would be willing to meet with Klaus Werner, the Panzer IV commander whose tank Helm had destroyed that morning in December 1944. Werner had survived the war, returned to Germany, and spent decades trying to understand what had happened at Noville. They met in Belgium in the summer of 1988, 2 old men visiting the forest where they'd tried to kill each other 44 years earlier. The meeting was awkward initially, conducted through a translator, both men uncertain what to say. Then Werner asked the question that had haunted him since December 18th, 1944. Did you know it would work? The bazooka, when you fired, were you confident it would penetrate? Helm's answer, recorded by the historian who'd arranged the meeting, was characteristically direct. No, I thought we were all going to die. I fired because it was the only chance we had. Werner nodded slowly, understanding completely. We thought we were invincible. Our tanks, our training. We thought American infantry couldn't stop us. He gestured at the forest around them, now peaceful and green. This place taught us differently. The two men walked through the forest together, identifying the spot where Werner's Panzer IV had burned, the position where Helm had fired his bazooka. The physical evidence was long gone, but the memory remained vivid for both of them. At one point, Werner asked if Helm felt guilt about killing German soldiers. Helm considered the question for a long time before answering. I felt relief. Relief that the weapon worked. Relief that I survived. Relief that my men survived. If that makes me a bad person, I've had 40 years to live with it. The engagement at Noville represented, in miniature, the trajectory of the entire Second World War. German forces, technically proficient and tactically skilled, were overwhelmed by Allied industrial capacity and material superiority. No amount of training or experience or tactical excellence could compensate for the fundamental disparity in resources. Germany fought a war it couldn't win the moment American industry fully mobilized, the moment those factories began producing weapons in quantities that transformed the battlefield calculus. The 150 American soldiers who faced 23 German tanks on December 18, 1944, didn't know they were demonstrating this principle. They simply fought with the weapons they'd been issued, in terrain that favored defense, against an enemy that had advanced too confidently into an ambush. But their success, replicated at hundreds of similar small engagements throughout the Battle of the Bulge and the final campaigns in Germany, proved conclusively that German armor superiority, such a dominant factor in the early years of the war, had been negated by American industrial production and weapon design. Sergeant Paul Helm died in 2003 at the age of 81. His obituary in the local Wisconsin newspaper mentioned his service in World War II but didn't detail what he'd accomplished. At his funeral, attended by family and a handful of surviving veterans from his unit, his grandson asked if anyone could explain what Grandpa had done during the war. An elderly man, one of the veterans, told a brief version of the story about Noville. He concluded by saying, "Your grandfather saved a lot of lives that day, including mine." That simple statement captured the reality better than any after-action report or historical analysis. In the fog-shrouded forest near a Belgian crossroads, ordinary men with reliable weapons had accomplished something extraordinary. They'd stopped an armoured thrust by an enemy that believed armour couldn't be stopped by infantry. The cost was 14, German tanks destroyed, and a battle group's momentum broken. The legacy was a demonstration that industrial capacity and weapon effectiveness could overcome tactical superiority and technical excellence. The truth, bought with courage and verified by the burning wrecks of German Panzers, was that warfare had changed, that the hierarchy of weapons systems that had dominated military thinking since 1939 no longer applied. The morning of December 18, 1944 began with fog and German confidence. It ended with fire and German withdrawal. In between, the course of a battle, and perhaps the trajectory of armoured warfare itself, was altered by men who believed their weapons wouldn't work but fired them anyway because they had no other choice. Their courage mattered. But what mattered more, what changed the outcome and shaped the future, was that American industry had given them weapons worthy of that courage. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.